The Lou Douglas Lecture Series has honored the memory of distinguished Professor of Political Science Lou Douglas, the man who helped start the Political Science Department here at Kansas State. We honor the memory of him by hosting speakers known for their intellect and their commitment to social justice, human rights, and international development. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Eugenie Scott, the Executive Director of the National Center of Science Education. As usual, tonight's lecture is going to be followed by a question and answer session. If you absolutely have to leave, we're going to break for a few minutes to let everyone leave the hall who must go, and then I encourage you to stay, if you can, for the question and answer session. Amy Walker, one of our interns, major in architectural engineering, will now introduce Dr. Scott. Thank you.
Good evening. On August 11th of 1999, the vote derided around the world was cast by the Kansas State Board of Education. By a 6-4 vote, a set of science standards written by 27 Kansas scientists and science educators was rejected in favor of a set of standards written in part by members of a Missouri-based creationist organization. Although the controversial standards did not endorse the teaching of creationism, they certainly left room for local schools to include the hypothesis in their curricula. The reaction from the media and the scientific community was swift, strong, and harsh. Criticism rained down on Kansas from all corners of the globe. For almost a year, powerful rhetoric from both sides of the issues filled the papers and airwaves across the state. In August of this year, the eyes of the nation were on Kansas, as 3 of the 6 board members who voted for the new standards were up for re-election in the primaries. And then it was over. 2 of the 3 members lost to pro-evolution candidates, and a reversal of the previous decision is virtually guaranteed. Still, there are many people in the state and across the country who wonder why there was such a controversy in the first place. They ask, why not creationism in the public schools? There are few people in the country more qualified to answer that question than our speaker tonight. Eugenie C. Scott holds a doctorate in biological anthropology from the University of Missouri. Her research as a human biologist has been in medical anthropology and skeletal biology. She is currently the president of the American Association of Physical Anthropologists and has received numerous awards for her contributions to science and science education. Dr. Scott served on the board of directors of the Biological Sciences Curriculum Study and has consulted with the National Academy of Sciences and several state departments of education. Dr. Scott is nationally known as a proponent of church-state separation and is an internationally recognized expert on the creation-evolution controversy. She has been, since 1987, the executive director of the National Center for Science Education, a pro-evolution nonprofit science education organization. She has made several media appearances promoting the scientific viewpoint on a wide range of television shows, including Nova, Firing Line, Geraldo, and The Pat Buchanan Show. Please welcome Eugenie Scott.
Good evening. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm going to give my presentation from here because I'm using this lovely equipment, and so you can just look right past me, and that'll work fine. Well, you know, titles of talks always have to be taken with a grain of salt, and they're always shorthand abbreviations of what people think or what people are actually going to be doing. In fact, it may surprise you, but I am in favor of creationism being taught in the public schools as comparative religion, but not as science. And I think there are many good reasons for not teaching creationism as science, and I'll try to share some of those with you this evening. But most Americans seem to feel as if they need to make a choice of some sort between religion and evolution. And certainly the polls, and there have been many polls measuring American attitudes toward creation and evolution, and the polls seem to bear this out, that people seem to dichotomize these two topics. The Gallup organization for a number of years has conducted polls on American religious attitudes and opinions. And Gallup asks 3 questions about evolution and creationism. The first question is, God created man pretty much in his present form at one time within the last 10,000 years. This is the essence of young earth creationism. Special creation about 10,000 years ago. Gallup also asks, man has developed over millions of years from less advanced forms of life, but God guided this process, including man's creation. This is the theistic evolution question, the idea that God created, but evolution happened. It was the way God did things. And then finally, the third question that God asks, that Gallup asks. Well, we'll get to God later, I guess. The third question that Gallup asks is, man has developed over millions of years. God had no part in the process. And over the last 15 or so years that Gallup has asked these questions, the results have been very consistent. To the young earth creationism question, about mid to high 40% of Americans agree, but a very strong percentage of American adults answer yes to the theistic evolution question, the middle one there, someplace between high 30s and 40%. And finally, the atheist question, evolution happened, God had nothing to do with it, is held by fairly consistently about 10% of Americans over time. Now, the National Science Foundation also surveys adult Americans every couple of years, and this organization also has a question on creation and evolution, or at least on evolution. They ask the question, I have a cheat sheet here, I shouldn't have made that mistake. These data from Gallup are pretty much the same for both black Americans and white Americans, blacks being slightly more conservative theologically. The National Science Foundation study asks, human beings as we know them today developed from earlier species of animals, true or false? And again, very consistently, less than half of Americans accept that evolution took place. This reluctance to accept evolution appears to be primarily an American phenomenon. When you compare this same question as it was asked internationally, you find that the United States is really quite low among other developed countries, and even some not very well developed countries like Bulgaria and the Czech Republic, in its acceptance of evolution. So there does seem to be a great reluctance on the part of many Americans to accept that evolution took place. And this reluctance to accept evolution is played out in many school districts around the country. That's what the National Center for Science Education does. We monitor this controversy and provide people advice and help and information on what to do about it. A few years ago in Marshall County, Kentucky, the superintendent recalled the 4th grade science books and glued together the pages that mentioned the Big Bang on the grounds that they only mentioned the Big Bang and didn't mention creationism as well. This, of course, generated some great editorial cartoons. But what can I say? It says adolescent rebellion. We should only be so lucky that the kids are sneaking out behind the garage and reading their science books. Now, this reluctance to accept evolution that we find in the general public is very, very different from the acceptance of evolution in the scientific community. The same Gallup questions were asked by a sample of scientists from American men and women of science, and the proportions of scientists accepting evolution versus that of non-science, not professional scientific Americans, is quite striking. If you look at the bottom of comparison here, the young earth creationist question, man was created pretty much in his current form at one time, past 10,000 years, 46% of the general public accept this, but only 5% of the scientific population accept this, and I'm surprised it's that high, to tell you the truth. On the other hand, if you look at the top 2 bars here, the atheist question, as it were, God had no part in the process, a much, much larger percentage of scientists agree with that compared to the general public. But I think it's very significant to look at that middle statistic there. To the theistic evolution question, the same percentage of scientists and the general public agree that evolution happened, but God is involved. God did have something to do with it. And I think that's very important to remember. This is not a dichotomy. You're going to get tired of that by the time I'm done talking tonight. One of the problems that I see with the creation-evolution issue is that people really don't understand what evolution is. If you're a fourth-year biology major, just bear with me. You probably know what I'm going to talk about. But otherwise, hang in there, because I think you may find evolution is not exactly what you thought it was. One of my favorite anecdotes these days is of a colleague of mine in physical anthropology, teaches in a community college back east, in the southeast, and she told me that she had a group of kids in her class, her freshman class that year, that had never heard the E word. I mean, their high school teachers had never taught them evolution. These kids hadn't a clue what evolution was. But this being a physical anthropology class, of course, she just, matter-of-factly taught evolution, no big deal. After about 3 weeks, these kids came up to her and they said, "Well, of course species change through time. You mean that's evolution? We thought evolution meant you can't believe in God." And I hear so many variants of that story from high school teachers and more college professors as well. So let's talk a little bit about what evolution is. Like a lot of things, there's a broad definition and a narrow definition. The broad definition of evolution is that it refers to change through time. And an awful lot of things in this universe of ours change through time. Stars change through time, galaxies change through time. The earth, living things, human cultures, lots of things change through time. I'm going to be talking today about biological evolution, because that seems to be the one, with the exception of Marshall County gluing together the Big Bang pages, that seems to cause more problems than other types of evolution. Biological evolution is a special kind of change through time. It's the idea that living things shared common ancestors from which they differ. This is something Darwin called descent with modification, which sounds like this wonderful polysyllabic 19th century phrase, but when you think about it, it's something you already understand very clearly, because you have descended with modification, as have we all. My sister and I have descended with modification from our father. We are not identical to our father. We share his genes, but we are not identical. My father is not identical to his grandfather. He has descended with modification from his ancestor. And my sister and I are more similar to each other than we are to our cousin Liz, because we have a common ancestor more recently in the past with our father than we do with our grandfather, which we share with our cousins. This idea of common ancestry and descent with modification is something that also works very clearly in the living world. We see that lions and hyenas are more similar to each other than they are to dogs, because lions and hyenas shared a common ancestor more recently with each other than they shared with their common ancestor with other carnivores. They're more similar to other carnivores than they are to howler monkeys or cebus monkeys, because you have to go back pretty far in time before you find a common ancestor of carnivora and primates. But they're more similar to each other. Lions and monkeys are more similar to each other than they are to newts or salamanders, because you have to go back very far in time before you find a common ancestor with them. And it's the same thing when you look at the fossil record as well. Lions and hyenas are descended from early felids, bears and dogs descended from early canids, and so forth. The more recent the common ancestor, the more similar the species. That's the big idea of biological evolution, common ancestry. But we can also talk about evolution on a lower level, on a more intimate level, as it were, as to what happens to a population through time. And I suppose that's the first thing that people need to understand about evolution, is that it is not an individual phenomena. There was a Kansas farmer quoted last year when you had your big kerfluffle about evolution, who was saying that he doesn't accept evolution because he has never seen a chicken turn into a cow. And he is absolutely right. Neither has anybody else, and individuals don't evolve. Individuals are born, live, and die. Populations evolve, or may evolve. So let's start with a population. Population consists of a group of organisms, okay? These could be butterflies, these could be rabbits, they could be salamanders. We'll talk about sexually reducing, That's true, too. Sexually reproducing organisms, just for the sake of argument. Asexual reproduction is not only less fun, but it also has other kinds of complications. But this population consists of individuals which vary from one another. Some of these rabbits have thicker hair, thicker coats, some have thinner coats, some have longer ears, some have shorter ears. There's variation among this population of organisms. This variation is produced by a series of mechanisms, most of which are genetic, which are actually reasonably well understood. Obviously, there's more to learn about any of this, but the basic genetic mechanisms of recombination, independent assortment, various kinds of mutation providing new genetic information and so forth, non-random mating, mate choice, all of these different genetic and genetically based mechanisms have to do with scrambling the variation in this population every generation. But now populations don't exist in vacuums. Populations exist in environments, and environments may have differences in temperature, in altitude, in humidity. There's other species living in that environment. There's members of your own, other populations of your own species living in the environment. So there are a lot of factors that act upon that population. Okay? And the most important of these factors is something called natural selection. But there's other factors as well. Natural selection is Darwin's wonderful mechanism of evolutionary change that refers to the population variation that we've been talking about. Some of the variants in this population, given the particular environment in which they're living, will live longer and have more offspring and thus pass on these genetic variations at a higher or lower rate than other members. That's what natural selection is all about. It's about this changing proportions of genes depending upon what the environment is. What happens when you have this situation of a population which every generation has lots of variation, but every generation is being impacted upon by the environmental factors? What do you have? This is about as fancy as NCSE graphics get, by the way. Notice the terribly clever little arrow here. What you get is change. Okay? Remember, biological evolution is a kind of change through time. This is what we're talking about. Looked at on the population level, it's a very important kind of change through time. Now, notice in this discussion about either the broad view of evolution or the narrower view of evolution, I was talking about what happened. I wasn't talking about who done it, right? Because like all sciences, what evolution is concerned with is the natural world and describing it, explaining it, coming up with the what happens. I think it's most useful if we think of evolution as a statement of history. And in terms of the ultimate cause of evolution, you're on your own. Physics is one thing, metaphysics is another. If you are a non-believer, you can see the natural forces that science has discovered as producing biological change, no problem. If you are a believer, you will probably tend to look at these natural forces of change that scientists have discovered as being part of the great scheme of things and part of God working through natural law, etc. Well, what do I mean by creationism? Well, creationism has also a broad and a narrow definition. The broadest definition of creationism is that the universe is created by a supernatural power. This could be God, this could be gods, many gods, it could be powerful spirits, it could be ancestors, it could be a variety of things. And most human populations, most human cultures around the world do have some idea of a creator, of a creation taking place. Among the Navajos, the hero twins created the first people. The Greeks have the Titans as the major creators. Of course, the Norse god Odin created most of the earth, and among the Eskimo, the sea witch Sedna cut off her fingers, who then swam away and then became the sea mammals. The idea of creation is something that's very, very common among human beings. But let's talk specifically about, shall we say, the Abrahamic traditions, because those are the ones that are most common in the United States, the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim view. Jehovah is the creator, or God, a single monotheistic God is the creator. I want to suggest to you that if someone says, I'm a creationist, you have no idea what that person believes. Okay? Because the word creationist has so very many meanings to different people in this society of ours. Unfortunately, it tends to reflect a dichotomous opinion. Many people think that you have to choose one or the other. This is a position that's promoted very strongly by anti-evolutionists, as if there are two warring camps and taking potshots at each other. I want to present the idea to you that it's not accurate to describe this creation-evolution dichotomy. It's much more appropriate, much more reflective of reality out there to refer to the creation-evolution continuum. And let's start with the most severe creationists, who are the flat earthers. Now, I am not making this up. There really is an international flat earth society. It's run by a very nice man named Charles K. Johnson, who lives in Lancaster, California. And Lancaster is over there on the eastern part of California near the Nevada border. Looks kind of like this. And I don't think this is actually why Mr. Johnson has the views that he does, but having been to Lancaster, I could be somewhat suspicious. If you ask Mr. Johnson and his approximately 200 members of the International Flat Earth Society why he believes that the earth is flat, he will tell you that he believes the earth is flat because that's what the Bible says. Now, clearly, this man is very extreme in his biblical literalism. This is not a point of view that other conservative Christians hold. Geocentrism is the next position on the creation-evolution continuum that I'm going to talk about tonight. Geocentrism, of course, is the idea that the Earth is the center of the solar system, as opposed to heliocentrism, where the sun is the center of the solar system. Now again, heliocentrists are a minority within the modern creationist movement. They're rather more numerous than are the flat earthers, believe me, but they still are really fringe kind of position. But there is a Tychonian society, Tycho Brahe, and this is extant today. It's run by a fellow named Jardus Buell, who lives up in Pittsburgh. Cleveland, pardon me. And he puts out a journal a couple times a year relating why he believes that the Earth is really the center of the solar system. Geocentrists and flat earthers take a very antique, really, view of biblical literalism. They interpret the cosmos pretty much as did the ancient Hebrews, as shown in this diagram. To the ancient Hebrews, the earth was a disk. It was round, but it was round like a nickel's round. It wasn't spherical. They talk about the circle of the earth. Well, the circle is 2 dimensions. The earth was this round disk that was floated on a sea, and there were the pillars of heaven holding up a firmament, which was basically a metal dome over the surface of holding up the sky. And above the firmament was the waters above the firmament, which is where the 40 days and 40 nights of rain came from. You can see the little water up there at the top of the diagram. And eventually you got heaven, and then God was in charge of the whole thing. But take a look at that diagram, because you'll notice underneath the firmament is the sun and the moon and the stars. Okay? What that means is that the ancient Hebrew conception of the earth was of a geocentric earth. The moon and the sun and the stars all traveled around the earth, as opposed to the heliocentric universe that we accept now. So the most strict biblical literalists, and there aren't very many of them, certainly, hold to this very ancient view of science. Now, of course, the rest of us have moved on through modern physics and chemistry and geology to reject these kinds of views, modern astronomy certainly. But there still is, further along the continuum, another group that we need to talk about, which is, again, beyond the ancient Hebrew conception of the universe, but still rejecting a good deal of modern science. These are the young Earth creationists. Now, young Earths geocentrists and flat earthers all hold to a particular kind of Christian theology called special creationism, which is really more concerned about how God created than the fact that God created. Because after all, God can create a lot of different ways. If you're a special creationist, you believe that God created everything all at one time and created the universe pretty much in its present form. So the stars and the moon and the galaxies and plants and animals were all created in essentially their present form and have pretty much remained that way since that creation event. The most of the special creationists today, you're most likely to run into young earth creationists who believe that this creation event took place about 10,000 years ago. So the more radical will go up to maybe 15,000 years ago, but certainly nothing like the billions of years that modern geology shows us. Now, young earth creationism is associated with something called creation science, which is an effort to take the special creation theology that God created everything at one time, it created the plants and animals and their kinds, and claim that there is scientific evidence to support it. So in this book by Henry Morris called Scientific Creationism, he writes, the purpose of the book is to treat all of the more pertinent aspects of the subject of origins and do this solely on a scientific basis, with no references to the Bible or to religious doctrine. However, the book is nonetheless peppered with references to religion, although in the public school edition they do make at least an effort to be not as obvious about it. For example, in discussing the origin of civilization, he says it would be located somewhere in the Middle East, near the site of Mount Ararat, where historical tradition indicates the survivors of the antediluvian population emerged from the great cataclysm, read flood, you know, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, we're talking flood here, right? Or near Babylon, where tradition indicates the confusion of languages took place. Well, of course, the flood story and the Tower of Babel and so forth, those are biblical stories. So I'm afraid the creation science people don't do a very good job of keeping religion out of their so-called science. In fact, Henry Morris, who is the author of that book and certainly the father of creation science, has written that the Word of God must take first priority, and secondly, the observed facts of science. So we know it comes first. If you ever get into the creationist literature, it's most fascinating. They keep coming up with these things that they claim will disprove that evolution happened, such as the finding of human and dinosaur footprints in the same strata down in the Paluxy River and in a couple of other places around the world. This is an example of a man track, as they are called. This is supposedly a human footprint discovered in very ancient beds where certainly no mammals belong. Well, I will leave it up to you if you find that very acceptable as a human footprint, but nonetheless. The basic concern of the young earth creationists, quite honestly, is that evolution is evil and is something that you should keep out of the schools because it is an idea that will damage children if they hear about it. They believe that if evolution is true, then there can be no God. If there's no God, then obviously there's no salvation, and if there's no salvation, then clearly we have no reason to behave well to one another, and society will simply go to hell in a handbag. Satan is the author of evolution, says Henry Morris. He says evolution is at the foundation of communism, fascism, Freudianism, social Darwinism, behaviorism, Kinseyism, materialism, atheism, and in the religious world, modernism and neo-orthodoxy. Jesus said a good tree cannot bring forth corrupt fruit. In view of the bitter fruit yielded by the evolutionary system over the past 100 years, a closer look at the nature of the tree itself is well warranted today. Yeah, this is a little over the top, you got to admit. But this idea that evolution is a tree of evil is something that shows up quite regularly in creationist literature. This is the cover of a program for the Bible Science Association Creationism Conference of, I think, 1995, held up in the Twin Cities. You can see on the branches of that tree of evil there, abortion, racism, radical feminist movement, drug culture, sexual perversion, all of the real true evils of society. And you see what is the source of all of this evil is evolution. And the creation science message is going to take care of evolution for us, and therefore all of these evils of society will go away. So evolution is seen as really the foundation of a lot of society's evils. Of course, an awful lot of these things were going on before 1859, but nonetheless, evolution is given credit for them anyway. Old Earth creationist is next on our continuum. Now, there's a whole subtaxonomy, as it were, of Old Earth creationists. It's really quite interesting, I think, to take a moment to discuss, because these are perhaps the most interesting group within this whole continuum. Among the Old Earth creationists are day-age creationists. Now, this is an old idea that goes back to at least the 1800s, if not earlier. I think it probably was actually around in the late 1700s. This is the idea that the 6 days of creation in Genesis were really long periods of time rather than 24-hour days. So it's a way of accommodating a more or less literal interpretation of the Bible with modern geology. Modern geology tells us that the world is very, very ancient. So one accommodation of that says that the 6 days are just very, very long periods of time. And many Christians find that to be very satisfying. Gap creationism is another kind of Old Earth creationism. Again, accommodating some of modern science, a lot of modern science, to the still a fairly conservative reading of the scriptures. In gap creationist, a long period of time is felt to occur between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. So Genesis 2, you get the whole 6-day, 24-hour day Adam and Eve story, but you still account for the very, very long period that geologists tell us the Earth has been around by having this billions of years or millions of years gap of time in between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Now, progressive creationism is a kind of old earthism which obviously accepts that the Earth is very old, but has God creating at intervals more and more complex organisms. So if you look at the geological column, you see simple single-celled organisms at the bottom, and then simple multi-celled organisms, more complicated multi-celled organisms. You get to the Cambrian and you get this wonderful abundance of invertebrate forms. A little bit later on you get vertebrates, and then the familiar amphibians, reptiles, mammals, birds, etc. God created these sequentially through time, is the view of the progressive creationist. This is still different from evolution, because evolution would say that these creatures had common ancestors. But a progressive creationist would just see the geological column is accurate. It really does reflect what happened through time, but it reflects a series of successive creations. Continuous creationism is yet another variant of old earthism. In continuous creationism, you have almost evolution in a way. You have God very much hands-on guiding evolution, very much hands-on guiding, for example, amphibians evolving into reptiles, evolving into the land tetrapods, and so forth. But God working a bit more through natural law, a bit more through the genomes, a bit more through the DNA, as it were, perhaps manipulating natural selection and so forth. Intelligent design theory is the newest kind of old earthism. Actually, it may not really be a kind of old earthism, although most of the proponents of intelligent design theory identify themselves as accepting the old age of the Earth, although there are intelligent design creationists who are young Earth creationists as well. So intelligent design is kind of a mixed bag. We can talk about that later if you'd like. So old Earth creationism has a lot of variation with it. But as you see, as we're going down the continuum, we're getting simultaneously a more liberal theology as well as more acceptance of modern science. Theistic evolutionists are the kind of evolutionists that we were talking about when I showed you that Gallup poll. Theistic evolutionists believe God created, as do all Christians, but believe that he used the process of evolution to do it. Now, there's a lot of gradations among theistic evolutionists as well. Some of them see God guiding more. Some of them see God pretty much having a general idea and then just seeing what happens. But it's the basic idea is that God is involved, but evolution did happen. So theistic evolutionists really accept all that modern astronomy, geology, and biology and anthropology have to tell us as far as the data and so forth. Some people consider theistic evolution to be a compromise, as it were, between religion and science. And you'd be surprised the number of cartoons I've been able to find having to do with theistic evolution. I'm tired of making decisions. Let's just go with natural selection. That's classic theistic evolution idea. You can't read the caption, I don't suspect, but the little guy is saying, instead of starting from scratch, why don't we just use modified chimp DNA? That's my favorite, I think. And for you physicists, you made it all out of quarks? Get out of here. The point being that I think religious people have taken sort of a bad rap on the creation-evolution controversy. I think religious people have been lumped together on one side of the dichotomy as all being extremists, all being flat earthers, whatever, whereas there's an enormous range of opinion within Christian and Jewish theology as to God's involvement with the production of the universe as we see it today. Yes, there are some yes, there are flat earthers, not very many of them. Yes, there are biblical literalists who have a very difficult time understanding, or accepting, I should say, that there's an awful lot of evidence out here showing that the universe has changed through time, that living things shared common ancestors. But it's not a uniform religious point of view. I was once doing a workshop for a bunch of ministers up in Idaho. It was really a lot of fun. They let me talk about real science instead of creation and evolution. And one of them told me about this really great marquee that he had seen on a church down the block from his, that he wished that he had thought of in time. This was at Easter time, and they were, of course, trying to encourage people to come to church. And the marquee said, "He came to take away your sins, not your brains." And I think that's a very healthy attitude today. But anyway, back to the continuum. At the bottom of the continuum here, we have something called materialism. Now, let me distinguish something here, because materialism is a philosophy, but it's also a term used within science. We talk in science about something, we restrict science to explaining the natural world using natural processes. This reliance upon natural processes is what philosophers of science called methodological materialism. That's a lot of syllables, but hang in there. Methodological materialism means we use materialism, which means matter and energy, right? Matter being what the universe is made out of. We restrict ourselves to material explanations, hence materialism. And we do this as a methodology in science. We don't do it because we're anti-religious. We don't do it because we're trying to disprove religion. We do it because it works. We have made wonderful discoveries about the nature of the the nature of the natural world using this methodological materialism. And when you think about it, it's a very practical rule for us to have. If we are allowed to say, gee, I'm having a really tough time here trying to explain a natural origin of life, or trying to explain how Neanderthals and modern sapiens differ, or whatever. I'm having a really tough time trying to explain why this variety of corn doesn't respond to the fertilizer. If you're having a really tough time trying to explain something scientifically, and you're allowed to say, God did it, then you stop looking for a natural explanation. If you stop looking for a natural explanation, you are guaranteed never to find one, right? So obviously, we have to just have this rule. We're not going to use any kind of supernatural explanation in our science. When we're wearing our scientist hat, we will only use natural material explanations. That's called methodological materialism. That's not the kind of materialism I'm talking about on the continuum. On the continuum, I'm talking about another kind of materialism called philosophical materialism. Now, what philosophical materialism is it is a materialist matter and energy philosophy that says matter and energy is all there is. There are no gods, there is no God, there's no fairies, there's no supernatural, there's nothing except matter and energy, and that's all there is in the universe. This is a philosophy. It goes back very, very far. Probably there was some caveman hunkered over his fire who thought, I don't really believe all this stuff about those gods. Obviously human beings have thought this way for a long time. Not very many of them. Most of them have accepted religion of some sort. But the important thing for our purposes is philosophical materialism and methodological materialism are not the same. We tend to use the word materialism in two contexts, and it's extremely important to realize what context the word is being used in, particularly if you are listening to anti-evolutionists who confuse this with great regularity. Quite regularity, you will hear anti-evolutionists saying, evolution is bad because it's a materialist enterprise. Well, yeah, but so is long division, right? I mean, so is photosynthesis. Evolution is no more philosophically materialist than any other aspect of science. Now, this is not to say that there are not some very profound philosophical implications to evolution. No question about that. But that's not part of the science itself. It's very easy for two scientists to look at the same scientific phenomenon. The same. Let's go out and look at a road cut here in Kansas, and we can see a strata, various strata of geological features through time. I am down there with the materialists as far as the continuum is concerned, and I would look at those various strata and say, yeah, this is the whatever it is, the order division, I don't know that much geology. This is why you should never do examples off the cuff. Okay, so this is the Cenozoic. I'm not bad on mammals. Okay, here we have the Paleocene and the Eocene. I don't even think you have strata like that here in Kansas. Sorry about that. You can straighten them all out later, geologists. Okay, so here we have a series of strata. Here's the Paleocene, the Eocene, and then we get a little farther, we got the Oligocene, the Miocene, and the Pliocene, and that's fine. And I would say, well, that's fine. That's the way the layers were laid down, and these are so old, and these are so old, and these are so old. A friend of mine who is a conservative Christian would come up and look at that same set of strata, and he would agree with me completely. Yes, this is Paleocene, this is Eocene, this is Oligocene, this is Miocene up here, and Paleocene, and so forth. This is this old, that old, this old, this old. And he might take from that, because of his particular religious views, he might take a rather different message metaphysically from that set of strata than I would as a non-believer. The nice thing about science is that it's an equal opportunity methodology. You don't have to have any particular religious or non-religious beliefs to study it. If you are a student of evolution, you may be religious, you may be non-religious. It doesn't matter. As long as you're using the methodological materialism, you are performing science. But this idea that somehow evolution is inherently atheistic is a major misconception that members of the general public have. And it's what is causing the majority of the conflict in our public schools. There are many individuals, many organizations, I should say hundreds of individuals and many organizations who are trying very hard to convince the American public that in fact this is a dichotomy. Evolution is inherently atheistic and your child should not be taught it in school because your child will then give up his faith. They make 3 points. That evolution is a theory in crisis, that evolution is on the skids scientifically, that many scientists are rejecting evolution, that it's soon going to be out the door. They make the point that evolution and religion are incompatible, as I've discussed, and they also argue that if you teach evolution, it's really only fair to teach creationism along with it. Well, remember the title of this talk, why not teach creationism in the public schools? We should not teach creationism as science in the public schools because each of these is wrong. And this is basically what these people are trying to get us to do. Let's take a look at this idea that evolution is somehow a theory in crisis. Arguments that you'll find quite regularly in the creationist literature are supposedly that gaps in the fossil record mean that evolution didn't take place. You can't get new body plans for mutation and selection. Chance can't produce design. Life is too complex to originate by chance. this whole equation of evolution with chance, which is so, so just blindingly wrong. It's just really quite amazing. Just as a quick little footnote here, most scientists accept that evolution is the major mechanism that produces evolutionary change. Natural selection is the absolute opposite of chance. Natural selection has to do with adaptation. It has to do with a particular trait or set of genes having a value in a particular environment. It is not chance that rabbits in cold climates have shorter ears than members of that species in hotter climates. That's not chance. That's adaptation. That's natural selection. People confuse these concepts of chance and design a lot, and it's too bad we don't have time to talk about that. I've actually written some papers on that for those of you who are interested in studying that further. But anyway, these arguments keep being brought up. Supposedly, microevolution is different from macroevolution. They don't really understand macroevolution, but that's something else. And of course, among the young earthers, that the earth is much too young for evolution to have occurred. Now, all of these arguments and many others are very, very familiar to anybody who's studied the creation and evolution controversy. You'll find back in the late 70s and early 80s, these ideas began to be promulgated with lots and lots of publications from the Institute for Creation Research, the Bible Science Association, and other organizations. And you'll find that about in the mid-80s to late 80s, there were probably a dozen books written by scientists, and I don't know how many hundreds of articles. I mean, I have filing cabinets full of articles on this stuff. It's a tough job, but somebody has to do it. In which these so-called scientific arguments are analyzed and rejected and shown why they're wrong. You keep seeing these arguments over and over, you sort of get this been there, done that kind of feeling. We don't have time to do a whole course on why the science of creation science is bad. But one thing that you might consider is what's going on at the college level. Okay? The creation and evolution controversy tends to be controversial at the kindergarten through 12th grade level, not at the university level. You go to any of the historical sciences here, astronomy, geology, biology, anthropology, you will find evolution is being taught matter-of-factly at Kansas State and at KU, and also at Brigham Young, Notre Dame, Baylor, and Brandeis. Evolution is taught matter-of-factly at any decent college or university in this country. And that's because it's not a theory in crisis within the scientific community by any stretch of the imagination. If you're curious about some of the refutations of these creation science arguments, just as a quick footnote here, you might like to take a look at talkorigins.org. It's a very interesting website, and of course our website also has many links to it as well. Among the big three creationist arguments, I've already talked quite a bit about the falsity of the idea that evolution and religion are incompatible. Let me move on to the fairness argument. Because, boy, this is one that really is popular. I'd say next to the religion idea, the fairness argument is the most powerful one they have going for it. Not because it makes sense, but just because it has such emotional appeal. Americans are a very fair-minded people. They tend to want to, we have town meetings, we tend to want to let everybody have their day in the sun. We tend to want to let all ideas be expressed, and this is a good cultural trait. But actually, that's not exactly the way science works. In the beginning of the development of a scientific idea, yeah, you let 1,000 flowers bloom, but then you weed out the ones that don't make it. You can go on the web today, and you can find a lot of sites promoting perpetual motion machines. But you know something? There isn't anybody in any university physics department who's spending time on perpetual motion machines, because we feel very, very secure that the second law and the first law of thermodynamics are really here to stay. And so we no longer keep testing them in the fashion that perpetual motion machines would test them. Science is not a democratic process. No matter how much people would love to have perpetual motion machines work, hey, we'd solve the energy crisis and nothing flat, no more worrying about heating oil. Nonetheless, perpetual motion machines don't work because they simply defy too many other things about science, about the way matter works that we already feel very, very comfortable about. There's a lot of other reasons why the fairness idea as applied to science and what we teach in the schools is really not an appropriate approach. One very quick thing for you to think about, though, is what exactly is the job of the high school teacher? Because what the high school teacher is not a researcher. We don't pay these people to sit at benches and make discoveries that will turn around the fields of science. What a high school teacher does, and does very well, and it's an extraordinarily important and very skillful undertaking indeed, is to take the consensus view of science, or the consensus view of history or literature or economics or whatever course the teacher is teaching. Take that consensus view and pick out the most important points and figure out a way of communicating those most important ideas to young people, to young minds who are still growing and still learning and still putting them together, these ideas together in a coherent fashion. That is an extraordinarily important thing to do, which most college professors are crappy at, quite frankly. I'm a recovering college professor myself. I can speak from a certain amount of authority here. High school teachers have a very important job, and they do it well. They are not researchers. What happens in high school is to take the consensus point of view. The consensus point of view in biology, astronomy, geology, anthropology is that evolution happened. Living things shared common ancestors, stars evolved, galaxies evolved, the planet Earth evolves. The universe has had a history. There has been this change through time. Well, what do? Scientists say teach evolution. You'll hear a lot of times a quotation from Theodosius Dobzhansky, a famous geneticist, from a title of an article that he wrote for the American biology teacher back in the 70s, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." Now, this may be a little hyperbolic. I'm sure if I were to sit down, I could probably come up with something in biology that did make sense without the light of evolution. I haven't come up with one yet, but I'm sure I could if I really worked at it. But that's not important. What really is important is not so much the title of the article, is what Dobzhansky said within the body of the article itself. He wrote, "Seen in the light of evolution, biology is perhaps intellectually the most satisfying and inspiring science. Without that light, it becomes a pile of sundry facts, some of them interesting or curious, but making no meaningful picture as a whole." See, evolution is to biology what the periodic table is to chemistry. Okay? It pulls it together. It makes biology make sense. It brings together a whole bunch of disparate, sundry facts that otherwise wouldn't make a coherent pattern, which is why the scientific community is so united in the teaching of, in the importance of evolution being taught. The National Academy of Sciences has said no other biological concept has been more extensively tested and more thoroughly corroborated than the evolutionary history of organisms. That's a fairly strong statement. The Academy is not exactly given to flights of hyperbole either. What do teachers say? Teachers say teach evolution. The National Association of Biology Teachers has instructed its members that, indeed, modern biologists don't debate evolution's occurrence, even though they do debate the details of evolution. And this is something, by the way, that is regularly confused by anti-evolutionists when they're speaking to the general public. They'll take an argument among scientists about how evolution takes place or the importance of mechanism A versus mechanism B, and this somehow gets translated into evolution as a theory in crisis. We argue over how evolution takes place, we don't argue over whether. And the anti-evolution movement is an argument over whether, not how. We're already arguing about how. The National Science Teachers Association has also directed its members to emphasize evolution in a manner commensurate with its importance as a unifying concept in science and its overall explanatory power, not just in biology either, by the way, but also in geology and astronomy. School boards say teach both. Well, may I take a small digression to talk about politics? Remember that school boards tend to be elected bodies, and elected bodies tend to view the world a bit differently than thee and me. When side A comes up to an elected body and says 2 + 2 = 4, and side B comes up and says 2 + 2 = 6, it's only clear that one must compromise. And this is indeed what teach both has become. Well, teach both? Remember the continuum. We teach evolution, but what do we teach on the other side? Do we teach flat earthism, geocentrism, young earth creationism, gap theory, day-age theory, continuous theory, progressive theory? What is on the other side of it? There's not a both. Both implies two. There's no two, right? There are too many and that's just Christianity. What do we do about Native Americans? There's probably 40 different creation stories among Native Americans. Which of those do we teach? Well, pretty soon we've got ourselves a comparative religion course, which I think is a great idea. But what's it got to do with science, right? So teaching both, the equal time argument, is both practically as well as intellectually not a very good idea. It's also not a very good idea because, frankly, to present evolution and also to present a creationist view, there would have to be a view rather than the view, because there's, Catholics look at creationism different from Baptists, and Mormons look at it differently still. So whose view do you teach? Whatever creationist view you're presenting in the public schools, if you are presenting it as an alternative to a science, in other words, you're advocating it, you are violating the First Amendment. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The other two have to do with freedom of the press and assembly. The establishment and free exercise clauses are the ones most important for understanding the relationship of religion and the body politic, so to speak. What they say is that a public body, such as a school, can neither advance nor inhibit religion. Schools have to be religiously neutral. By presenting, say, theistic evolution in these schools, you are trampling on somebody else's religion. You're trampling on the religion of a biblical literalist. By presenting a Christian view, you're trampling on the religion of a Jew or a Buddhist. We have to be religiously neutral in our schools. Teaching both is bad from a pedagogical, from a logical, and from a legal point of view. Can we keep everybody happy? Well, I think so, or at least most people. My recommendation is to teach evolution, indeed. We need to have evolution taught in our schools. Our students do need to be educated. But we need to teach it with sensitivity. Our teachers, and this is college professors as well as high school, need to learn and teach accurately about the nature of science itself. Science is not philosophically materialistic, it is methodologically materialistic. There is nothing inherently atheistic about a scientific approach to things, whether it is understanding cell division or understanding descent with modification. Most religious people do not believe that God is there personally lining up the chromosomes of every cell in everybody's body here. God works through natural law, according to many believers. Why not descent with modification? But whatever your religious view, that's something you have to do outside of science, because science can neither prove nor disprove the existence of God or his activity. Teachers need to learn and teach accurately about the nature of evolution. The fact that all we're talking about is what happened, not who done it. We cannot make ultimate cause assumptions if we're talking about science. I also suggest that it's useful to let students know in descriptive fashion about the diversity of religious approaches to creation. The little exercise that I did with you this evening on the creation-evolution continuum is on our website. If any of you teachers want to download it and try it in your own classes, as long as you're not saying, but you should be here, or you should be here, or you should be here, that is perfectly legal to describe religious views. You can always talk about religion in the public schools. You cannot advocate religion or a specific religious idea. Don't confuse those two. I would also suggest, again, teaching about creationism, but in non-science classes. Well, what about those students who do come from a religious tradition in which evolution is simply unacceptable to them? Well, what do you do with students who have a very strong feeling about evolution? I suggest that it is not a good idea to just let those students walk out of the class, which many of their parents try to get teachers to do. It's called opting out. I don't think that's good for the student. I think the student needs to learn evolution. The student doesn't have to accept evolution. And by the way, I trust none of you believe in evolution, right? I don't believe in evolution. The word belief, the verb believe, is not something we use in science. Do you believe in thermodynamics? No, you'd feel very silly saying that. You don't believe in evolution either. I accept evolution as the best explanation for all of those fossils in the geological column and for all those wonderful anatomical homologies that we see and all those wonderful biochemical homologies. It's the best explanation that living things had common ancestors. It's just a great explanation. But if somebody were to come up with some data tomorrow that completely throws that out and does a better job of explaining the fossil record and all the homologies, etc., that would be just wonderfully cool, because this would open up so many new areas of research that it would, make your head spin. You don't believe in evolution. And a student learning evolution who comes from a very serious conservative religious tradition doesn't have to believe in evolution either. As one teacher told me, I just tell the kids they just have to learn it to pass the exam. And they all go, oh, whew, thank goodness, I thought I had to believe it. No, you don't have to believe anything you learn in school. They probably didn't tell you that, did they? But it's true. I can say that because I'm out of the classroom now. And actually, high school teachers are quite sensitive about that. I think a great fear that many Americans have is that their kid will go to school, the teacher will say, here's all the evidence for evolution, here's why we accept evolution, therefore take your religion and shove it. That happens occasionally at the college level. The incident of that happening at the high school level is vanishingly small. Teachers tend to pretty much track the rest of the American public in terms of their adherence to religious belief. They're about 90% religious, just like all the rest of Americans. And so the probability of teachers taking that point of view is pretty small because it would disagree with their own theology as well. And even teachers who are non-believers, the ones I've spoken to anyway, tend to realize that it's not their job to try to reform a student's religious beliefs. That's the student's own business, and the student has a right to retain or change those beliefs as he or she sees fit. But as I say, teachers are actually much more sensitive to these issues than many people realize. The National Science Teachers Association, in fact, even instructs its teachers, its members in its statement on evolution, that they should not advocate any religious views about creation, nor advocate the converse, that there is no possibility of supernatural influence in bringing about the universe as we know it. Teachers should be non-judgmental. In California, the State Board of Education policy on natural sciences, I think, states the same idea rather well. To be fully informed citizens do not have to accept everything that is taught in the natural science curriculum, but they do have to understand the major strands of scientific thought, including its methods, facts, hypotheses, theories, and laws. In other words, education does not compel belief. The goal is to encourage understanding. So even a religiously conservative student should learn evolution. No one is saying you have to accept it. And I think there is a way to bring a certain amount of peace to our classrooms if we just teach evolution with maybe a little more sensitivity than we have taught it in the past. I would like to see this because I would hope very much that we would not reach the point any more than we have reached it so far, as expressed in this cartoon, where the kids say, all right, it's summer vacation, we're free, now we can do all the things we couldn't do during the school year. And there they are reading their Darwin. Thank you very much for coming out to hear me tonight. I very much appreciate this large audience. His question was, why us, Lord? Why is it that the United States ranks so low in its acceptance of evolution compared to all these other countries? I think it has to do with a variety of things. Certainly the religious history of the United States. Remember, the United States was settled by religious mavericks, very non-hierarchical people. I mean, they came over here to get away from hierarchy, and so there tends to be an awful lot of BYO theology developed in American religious history. We are the nation that has developed Millerites and Jehovah's Witnesses, the Latter-day Saints, a whole variety of homegrown religions. As a result, I think, of the fact of our sort of frontier settlement history, and the fact that we don't take orders very well. We want to establish our own theology, and some of these groups live and some of these groups die. Also, in the second decade of the 1900s, a specific religious movement called fundamentalism was born. From about 1915 to 1919, I think it was, 12 booklets called the 12 Fundamentals were published, which laid out a real back-to-basics kind of biblically oriented religion, Protestant religion. And even though interestingly enough, the booklets themselves were not terribly anti-evolutionary, the subsequent fundamentalist movement did become very much anti-evolutionary for a variety of reasons. A very good book on this is written, it deals with part of this, is Summer for the Gods by Ed Larson. It's a story about the Scopes trial and the events leading up to it. Won a Pulitzer a couple years ago. So the history of fundamentalism in America is part of it, because fundamentalism was not a successful export. It didn't go anywhere on the continent or in Great Britain or anyplace else. The second thing that I think helps to explain why we have high degrees of anti-evolutionism is our educational history. The fact that the United States has this extraordinarily decentralized education system. Now, if you were to, we had a young woman living with us a couple summers ago who was a French college student. She was studying to be a teacher. And she was describing the French system to us, and it was really quite a bit different from ours. And if you talk to any person from Europe, they'll give you a similar description. If you are a fourth grader and you're in Paris, you will be learning this, and this during the second week of April. Let's say you move and you go to Lyon. And when you start your new school in Lyon, you'll be learning this, and this in the second week of April. They have the same curriculum wherever you go. Now, in the United States, you don't even get the same curriculum from one school to another in the same district, much less within the same state, much less across states. We have an extraordinarily decentralized education system, probably having to do with our frontier settlement patterns and the fact that these little frontier communities had to solve all their own problems, including law enforcement, including religion, including education and everything else. So we got used to this local control, which we have absolutely idolatrized. I mean, the third rail of American politics is local control of education. You don't touch it. I mean, you are doomed if you even try. So I think it's that combination. Plus, we don't really have very high levels of science literacy in this country. And I think the fact that evolution is systematically not taught at the K-12 level, plus the religious conservatism, plus the decentralization, which of course affects variable number one there, I think probably explain the majority of the reason for that. Yes?
Dr. Scott, you say teach about creationism, but not in a science class.
Correct.
Now, in high school, when I come to college, I have the opportunity to take religion and culture, cultural anthropology, philosophy of religion. I have the opportunity to expand my mind and knowledge about creationism in other classes. In high school, you have a specific curriculum you have to do, and you don't have that opportunity as much. What would it hurt for a biology teacher to teach evolution, and then when a student asks, well, how did this happen, who did this, teach the continuum. Like you're given an hour this evening to do a quick broad view of the Christian Judeo continuum. Why could a high school biology teacher not have the knowledge to teach teach an overview continuum?
Her question was, the high school curriculum is pretty full. You don't have that many electives. It'd be nice to be able to have some of this information. And her point was, actually, you can go through the continuum a lot faster than I did tonight. With high school kids, I do go through it more quickly. And actually, high school teachers have used the continuum I think, to good extent. That's not the same thing as sort of doing an extensive discussion of a whole variety of creation stories or comparative religion, which I think would also be a very useful thing for high school kids to know. Teachers tend to use that continuum as a way of sort of defusing the religion issue, because kids come into the class thinking there's a dichotomy you've got to choose, and just purely descriptively, if a teacher describes, just again, as you said, this is just even within one, this is part of one religious tradition. We're not even going into, specifics of what do the Catholics believe, what do the Baptists believe, and all that. But just to sort of help, just open the kid's eye that, yeah, you're right. There's more than one choice here. Gee, I call it getting the fingers out of the ears. Because a lot of the kids come in and they don't want to hear about this. The evolution's an evil idea. And then all of a sudden you realize, geez, there's a lot of people out there who don't have to feel this way. But I still think, a little anthropology at the high school level is a good idea. Sir?
Yes, ma'am. I hang around with a bunch of old psychiatrists. And sometimes they talk about a guy named Carl Jung and archetypes. It's not really on the science end or religion end, but someplace in the middle. I wondered if you knew about him and any concepts of how this interrelated in kind of approach his presentation to people, students.
Too bad my Uncle John isn't here. My Uncle John Scott is a devotee of Jung. He just thinks Jung hung the moon. I don't. I would suggest that any student interested in Carl Jung, that's J-U-N-G, check with some of your psychology professors. They might be able to give you some readings. I don't think Jungian archetypes are quite what I'm dealing with here. I think most scientists would not consider them to be very scientific, although certainly Jung did. He thought they were. Yes, sir.
You've been very inclusive, but I have a divisive question for you.
Go for it.
Recently, the Supreme Court used the idea of disclaimers in textbooks. The three most conservative justices voted essentially took a positive point of view toward putting in disclaimers about evolution. One of our major political candidates would use that kind of justice as a model for future appointments to the Supreme Court. Are you worried about that?
The question was a political one. First of all, the National Center for Science Education is a 501(c) organization which cannot engage in any kind of lobbying. We cannot support candidates. We do not support candidates. I'm definitely voting. I'm not going to sit home. I'm definitely going to vote. And I personally am going to be thinking very hard about who those Supreme Court nominees in the future are going to be. Because, quite frankly, if you look at the legal history of the creation and evolution controversy, I discussed very quickly the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. All of the cases that have come before either any federal court and many state courts, and certainly the Supreme Court, have all hinged upon the interpretation of that Establishment Clause. The Supreme Court uses, I'll be talking about this in more detail tomorrow evening, actually. I'll be talking about more legal aspects. When is that talk anyway? 7:30? 8:15, and where is it? Union 212, if you want to hear more about the legal aspects of this issue. But there are three tests that the Supreme Court uses for Establishment Clause cases. Does the law or statute have a religious purpose? Does it have a religious effect? Or does it create unnecessary entanglement between the state and the religious institution? And that came from a court case called Lemon versus Kurtzman back in the 70s. It's called the Lemon test. The mnemonic that I use is, if the law's a lemon, you apply the but the purpose prong of Lemon has been the one criterion that the Supreme Court has used in all of the creation and evolution cases since the mid-70s. And the district courts have used it as well. Currently on the Supreme Court, Rehnquist, Scalia, Thomas, thank you, are dead set against the Lemon, the purpose prong of Lemon. They want to drive it into the ground and get a case that they can use to completely overthrow this particular test for church-state separation type cases. I personally worry about that. I worry about people being added to the court that won't keep an eye on that. But I do encourage you all to vote. You do have an election coming up. And when Amy introduced me, she mentioned the voting in the primary for the school board candidates, State Board of Education. To my way of thinking, I was pleased at the results from Kansas, because it does appear as if the standards will be reconsidered and the substandards rejected, and the real standards, which John Staver and some other people at this institution worked on, will be the standards under which Kansas students will be taught. And I think that's good for your science literacy in the state and for your state's education, the education of your students. But I encourage you to not stay home. That was just the primary. If you feel, as I do, that the current candidates should be supported, I guess virtually everybody running now, not all, but almost everybody running is in favor of changing the standards. But you should get out and vote for whichever candidate you support, because they need that imprimatur, as it were, to make the changes that we hope they make. Yes, sir.
I'm interested in the intelligent design movement. I really never seen the design laid out very mathematically how design can be established in many different fields, such as forensics. I heard what you said that you believe that intelligent design is not on a scientific basis.
The question had to do with a new kind of anti-evolutionism called intelligent design theory. Indeed, this is new. The old creation science arguments, been there, done that, I mean, they really don't have any validity. Intelligent design is a phrase that actually came about in the early 80s, but it didn't get rolling until the late 80s, the publication of a book called Of Pandas and People back in 1989. William Dembski published his book, I think, in 95 something, and he's published another one subsequent to that. Intelligent design is an idea that tries to separate itself from young earth creationism. It tries to present itself as something different, as being more scholarly, more intellectual. Dembski's work is I think, something that they showcase a lot because it's full of mathematical formulas, and there's a lot of discussion of information theory, and it really, it is more scholarly, certainly, than something that you would find written by Henry Morris from the Institute for Creation Research. That said, does it deserve to be taught in high school? I would suggest that it's premature to make that claim, which is being made. Before something is ready for prime time, as it were, it really does need to get sifted and winnowed by the scholarly establishment. Now, Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box, of course, the various books by Philip Johnson, written in the early, well, starting in the early 90s up until the present, Dembski's books, these are all claiming to be different approaches. In content, they tend to be very similar to a lot of the anti-evolutionism that we have seen. Behe's book and Dembski's book have actually been looked at by biologists in the former case and philosophers of science. Thus far, it hasn't had much of a bandwagon effect. when you read the book reviews by professional philosophers of science, and write me at our website and I can send you some references to those reviews, you find that they say, well, no, it doesn't work because of this, this, and this, and step 2, he gets the probabilities wrong. Step 1, it's a God of the gaps kind of argument. This is a problem. You look at the criticisms of Behe's Darwin's black box, and people will argue that he actually has not demonstrated that there really are irreducibly complex structures. If there are, taken for sake of argument, if there are irreducibly complex structures, there's no reason why they could not be produced by natural selection, because Behe really garbles the natural selection part. So basically, intelligent design theory has not been accepted by the scholarly community of biologists, other scientists, or philosophers. If it does, then yeah, obviously it should be incorporated into the sciences. But it's premature. Right now, they haven't won their spurs, so to speak. They're working on it. Maybe they will someday. I tend to be a little, well, I got my PhD at Missouri, and you got to show me. How are we doing on time? Okay. Yes, sir, and back?
Isn't evolution the wrong thing to be worried about when instead we should be concerned with the de-evolution of species that die off, of tens of thousands of species, all of this creation, which is going away and will never be back? Shouldn't that be the thing that society is concerned about instead of this question?
I'm very concerned about the reduction in biodiversity and the mass extinction that we appear to be going through. I don't think it has to be an either or. Pardon me?
How do we bring back the center stage instead?
Well, I don't know about instead. I mean, I'm...
Isn't it a
Well, I can think of a lot of very important questions that we should be concerned about. I mean, I'm very concerned about child welfare. I'm very concerned about little children, not getting appropriate nutrition in this country and other countries. I'm very concerned about kids suffering because their parents don't take good care of them and beat them. I'm very concerned about people in jails as political prisoners. I mean, I can think of a lot of good causes. I happen to work in the area of creation and evolution. I'd like your support for that. But don't forget there's other important things to be concerned about as well.
My point is that when enough species die off, we die off too.
Yeah, there's a book that's coming out. Gosh, I wish I could remember the name of it now. Written by a biologist up in Washington State, where he talks about what the world of 2500 is likely to, or 2200 is likely to look like, considering the tremendous destruction of the world's biodiversity that we see today. And he suggests that it's basically going to be the trash species. It's going to be pigeons and rats, all these kind of weed species of plants and animals. And obviously we should be concerned about that. Yes, ma'am.
I'm sure that you're familiar with the Scopes trial, and we just reviewed that in my class, and a big portion of that came out in that trial. If you read the transcript, is a sense of anti-intellectualism, and I see some similarities between the 1920s and the 1990s, and I wondered if you could speak to what you see as perhaps a concurrent trend in anti-intellectualism.
The question had to do with anti-intellectualism. Are we going through a Scopes-type period of decline in our respect for intellectual solutions to things? I don't have a very profound comment on that. I think stating the problem may be sufficient. I agree with you. I think that we have moved... we never gave the Enlightenment a chance. I mean, there's this whole notion of modernism, which is supposed to be this philosophical view of post-Enlightenment philosophy, where we use logic and reason and our human capacities for love and understanding to produce a better world. somehow we never quite got into that completely. I mean, there's a certain stratum or two of society that did, but by and large, most of humanity has muddled through pretty well with the same old dark superstitions that they had during the Middle Ages. I don't know. I tend to be fairly short-tempered with postmodernists because, like I say, modernism never really got a fair shake. But yes, I would like to see us respecting the qualities of the human mind and its ability to solve problems. Not that that means you leave the heart out, mind you, but nonetheless. One last question, sir.
I'm one of those science teachers who try to be sensitive to issues. They're going to get wrong. My real concern is the fundamentalist, anti-evolutionist. I wonder if they have a handle on what that does to the psyche of the children. I mean, you send your kid to school to learn knowledge, to understand the wisdom of the ages, but don't listen to that part. What does that teach the kid? Which part of the wisdom that's been accumulated by the human race do we ignore? Which part do we accept? I watch my students in my class dealing with that all the time. I hate my students because the kid said, student actually said, is this that awful stuff that we talk about every week? My mom told me not to listen and turn and face the wall. Now, so
Yeah.
how do they instruct their kids? How do they decide which knowledge is worth listening to and which is worth ignoring? That's what baffles me.
I have nothing to add to that. I agree. I mean, I think it's very sad. Did you all hear? He has a pretty good voice. Did you all hear him? Yeah. It's, I don't know, it's something I've been curious about as well. I don't raise my child that way. I don't understand that tradition. But obviously some people feel it's extremely important that their children closely reflect their own views and values. And by rearing them with these blinders on, they managed to do it. Maybe that's why homeschooling is so popular. Oh, all right, one last question. And I,
Yes, I had a question for you regarding one of the arguments that the young Earth creationists have, arguing for a young Earth. I wonder if you've heard what the scientific explanation is. It has to do with moon dust. Bear with me.
I'll do it. I can do it faster. Yes.
They've calculated the size of the pads had to be really huge so it wouldn't sink down into the dust of the moon.
No, that's what the creationists said. That's not actually what the NASA said.
Oh, I read that they...
That's right.
They think the pad's really big.
They did that for stability.
They said if the moon was really 4 billion years old, there should be 15 feet of dust on the moon. But when they landed there was only about 3 or 4 inches, which would be if it was only 6,000 years old.
You know, the young Earth creationists are just wonderful to read. I mean, this stuff would be so much fun if it weren't so serious, you know. And the dust on the moon argument is a real classic young Earth creationist argument. Here's how it goes. You evolutionists believe that the Earth is billions of years old. Now, we have measurements cited from a scientific source of the amount of meteoritic dust that sifts into the Earth's atmosphere. It was collected on Mauna Loa in Hawaii, and judging by the amount of nickel that comes in from this dust, you can estimate the amount of meteoritic dust. And if, 400,000 tons of meteoritic dust falls on the Earth every year. So obviously that same amount falls on the moon too, but without an atmosphere to burn it up, it just accumulates on the moon. If you evolutionists are right, that the Earth and the Moon are billions of years old, there should be actually, I think, 232 feet of meteoritic dust, some enormous amount of meteoritic dust on the Moon. And when the astronauts landed on the Moon, there were only a couple of inches of dust. Therefore, the Moon is young. Therefore, the Earth is young. Therefore, evolution didn't happen. Therefore, creationism did happen. These people never met a rate they didn't love. I mean, they're just wonderful. That take, the rate of meteoritic dust infusion collected at Mauna Loa, etc. They take that and they expand it back billions of years, and it's just wonderful stuff. It's just grand. The problem is, the devil is in the details here, and this is the problem that you have with young Earth creationism in general. If you go back to the source that they cite, it's an article by a man named Hans Pedersen, published in Scientific American. Scientific American is an interesting publication, but it's a popular magazine. It's not a scientific journal, right? I mean, there's car advertisements and advertisements for trips to the Bahamas. This is not a scientific journal. None of my scientific journals have car advertisements in them. This is, they have a different purpose. It's not a scientific journal. It's good, solid stuff in general, and that's fine. But it's not, you wouldn't base an entire theory on it. If you go back and you read Pedersen's article, number one, it was written back in the late 1960s. They are still citing it 40 years later as if this is cutting-edge science. Even within the article Pedersen wrote in the late 60s, he said, these measurements of the amount of nickel collected in atmospheric dust in Mauna Loa could be off by a factor of 100. Well, it turns out they were, because what happened is shortly after that article was published in the early 70s, there actually was satellite collection of the amount of actual meteoritic dust from the atmosphere, from the high atmosphere itself, not down below. And it was found that it's actually considerably less than what they found from those earthly measurements, which were contaminated with various sources. But what is just so wonderful about this is this argument never dies. I mean, this argument goes on and on and on, and it's been refuted 100 times. Take a look, if you're on the internet, at talkorigins.org, and just type in "dust on the moon" for the search, and you'll get acres and acres of discussion as to why this is a really poor idea. But the fact that they keep citing 40-year-old data as if it is absolutely current and cutting edge is, I think, very indicative of why this stuff is not science and why it should not be taught in the public schools. Let my people go. Maybe it was a Hollywood set. Thank you so much for coming tonight.